The last step in the process, once you have done your spinning of your fiber into yarn, and then if you choose to ply that yarn after you've done the plying, so you can do your finishing of your yarn when you've just got a singles on your spindle or when you have applied yarn, whichever version is how you plan to use the yarn when you're done. The last step is to take it from the spindle where you spun it and turn it into a skein where you'll be ready to actually knit or crochet or weave with it. So there is some specialist equipment that you can use to do this step, but it's not required. And if you're just getting started, you can spin for quite a while until you really start making larger quantities of yarn before you would really need to consider getting any kind of specialist equipment. So the first thing that you're going to need is something to wrap your yarn around. I happen to have this metal basket. A cardboard box works fine. You can do it around your arm and just twist it like if you're winding up an extension cord. That's just a little bit harder for me to show you on video. You can use the back of a chair. I mean, absolutely anything you've got. If it does have some place where you can tie the end to it, that can be useful. But if it doesn't, you can just hold it in place with your finger. So you're going to take the end and you are just going to begin wrapping around. Just begin wrapping it around. Make sure if you are using a homemade device to wrap it around, make sure your item does not get larger at the top so that you won't be able to slide your loop off at the end. So if you've got a chair that gets tall or gets wider at the back or at the top, if you wind it around the bottom and then you try to slide it off, you're not going to be able to. So once you have wound all of your yarn around, you are going to get to the point where it was attached to your leader. Generally, if you just pull, you can get that leader to come out pretty easily. And now, once you have all of your yarn wrapped around, you will probably have a lot more wraps than I do. It's fairly boring to watch somebody wind yarn around a box, so I just chose to get a little bit here. Then you are going to want to take ties. I would recommend using a yarn that is a strikingly different color than the yarn that you spun, but preferably one that is unlikely to bleed. So generally blue yarns and red yarns tend to bleed a lot. I probably wouldn't make the ties either of those colors, but any yarn that you've got laying around is going to work to do this. And you are going to want 3 of those. I like to leave them about this long, maybe 6 or 8 inches long. You don't want tiny little short ones. It's just a little bit harder to work with to get those to tie up. But you are going to want to do, and my loop is starting to act up a little bit here and jump off the box. Let me wrangle that back down again. You are going to want to tie this off in 3 places. I like to make 2 of those places where the ends are. So the end that I've still got in my hand here, I'm going to take my tails for tying, and I'm going to tie what's called a figure 8 knot. So I'm going to take the wraps of yarn that I have on here, I'm going to eyeball it, divide them in half, and I'm going to poke my tie yarn under half of them. I'm going to wrap it around the bottom, and I'm going to come back up through that halfway point. So I've got my tie yarn wrapped around like a figure 8 around that. And then I'm going to put the end of my spun yarn in with the ends of my tie yarn, and I'm just going to tie an overhand knot, just a super basic knot. You do want to make sure that that tie is really loose so you can see how much space there is in there. You don't want this to really cinch up tight. You want to make sure that the twist can travel around through that. It's not like pinching it closed. And you also want to make sure that it can spread out to dry easily. If you have that pinched really tightly, you are going to find that that spot is not going to dry as quickly as the rest of it does. And you're going to do that at the other tie. So if you were using something that you could tie it to, you'll want to untie that. You're just going to grab another tie, exactly the same, and do the same thing. Do that figure 8 where you divide it in half and you go up and over and around and back through. Tie the ends of your spun yarn together with the ends of your tie and just tie an overhand knot. So you've got 2 of these that are determined by where the ends happened to be. You are going to always want a third tie. I don't care if you made such a small skein like I did, or you have a giant big skein, you want 3 ties. And this is going to have to do with how easy this skein is going to be to wind into a ball later. 3 ties is just going to keep everything organized a lot better and make that winding into a ball when you're finished that much easier. And so you can place the third one kind of evenly centered between the other two is to the best of your ability. It doesn't matter so much where that third one is. Just try to place it someplace where they're going to be about as even as it's possible. Once you've got that, now you can take it off and you are finished with the chair or whatever it is that you're winding it around, and you'll notice how it immediately sort of, I call it seizes up. It looks like it's got a lot of twist in there, like it's twisting back on itself a lot, and it does a little spiral. It is supposed to. You've done that right. In fact, if you pick it up off of whatever you've put it on and nothing happens, it doesn't do that where it curls back up on itself, you did not put enough twist in that yarn. You want it to do this, and you want it to do it about this much. So if it jumps way up and it turns into this tight little knot right up by your hand, there's probably a little bit too much twist in there. So you want it to look about like this one does, where there's some spring back, but not, it doesn't curl up into a tight little mess. And that's about where you want it to be. The last step is you are going to submerge this in warm water. Generally, I just do this in the sink. You can put a plug in your kitchen or your bathroom sink. Fill it up with warm water, just as warm as it comes out of the tap. And you're just going to let it sit in there. If you are worried about your yarn having a little bit of dirt in it as you spun it, if you have some reason to feel like there's a little bit of dirt in there, you certainly can put a little squeeze of soap in with it. I would recommend getting one of the wool washes that you do not need to rinse out again. You can put just a couple of drops in there if you feel like it's dirty. If that's not a concern for you, you can certainly just use tap water. That is almost always what I do. If you notice a lot of color comes out, so the water in here is clear. If your water turns a bright color, you may want to pick the skein up, squeeze a little bit of the water out of it, drain the water, and put fresh warm water back in there to make sure that the water that second time is clear. It's not super uncommon to get some color coming out of your yarn after you spun it, just because of some of the difficulties in dyeing fiber. You can't be as aggressive with rinsing when you're dyeing fiber, and because you would felt the fiber, you have to be very, very gentle with it. And so it's not uncommon for after you have spun yarn to have it lose a little bit of color. Generally on the second or sometimes the third soaking, that extra color is going to be gone. And it's not that your fiber hasn't taken the dye and the fiber has changed colors. There was just a little bit of extra dye material in that to start with, just because it's hard to rinse fiber without felting it. So once your yarn has soaked, I generally say 5 or 10 minutes of soaking. You are just going to squeeze out as much water as you can, obviously with a larger skein of handspun, which most of you will have. There's going to be a little bit more squeezing involved, but you don't have to be really, really gentle with it for the fear that it's going to felt. Yarn is just not that fragile. You are going to turn it back into that loop. At this point, you'll notice now it hangs a lot straighter, so much so that you can't see the entire thing in front of me here like you could the last time. And that is just because the water has allowed that twist to relax and spread out a little bit, so the whole thing is going to lay a little bit nicer. It does still twist up on itself, so you can see if I start it as a loop, it is still going to twist back on itself a little bit, and that is still absolutely fine. The last thing that you want to do, once you've created this loop, it's wet, you've gotten out as much water as you possibly can, you're going to thwack it. That is a highly technical term. You're just going to put the loop on your hand and you're going to smack it. down on the table, on your bathtub, wherever you happen to be. And then I like to move my hand about a third of the way down the skein and then do the same thing again. And then move it about a third of the way again and do it again. So 3 times. And that just allows the twist again to kind of move around. So if you had a lot of extra twist in one strand here, and then you had less twist over here, thwacking it that way when the fibers are all wet and kind of open and a little bit more malleable than normal is going to let that twist even out just a little bit. I mean, if you have areas that have way more twist and areas with way less twist, it's not going to fix everything, but it does make everything just lay a lot nicer. Once you're to this point, you are just going to hang it up and let it dry. I think hanging it over the shower head is a great place. Often your skein is going to drip a little bit, so don't hang it over carpeting. I have also hung it over fence posts outside or the front doorknob on the outside. And after probably 12 hours, there's no danger of dripping anymore. You can move it someplace else to hang to dry, but it may take 2 or 3 days to fully dry depending on how big your skein is and your local weather conditions about how humid it is. Wool can hold up to a third of its weight while wet and not feel wet to the touch. So generally, if it's possible, after you think it's dry, let it hang another 12 to 24 hours just to make sure it really and truly is all the way dry. And then it's ready to use.